Good evening, everyone. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming. We want to get this started right away. We're running just a couple minutes late. I want to introduce to you Steve Wenzel, professor here at CLC, and he's been instrumental in bringing Steve Young tonight. I think you will be very interested and very engaged in what Steve has to offer tonight, or Steve Young has to offer tonight. And without further ado, I want to bring up Steve Wenzel for the introduction of Steve Young. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that very kind introduction. I want to welcome all of you here tonight to tonight's Rosenmeier Forum and for the excellent speaker we will have on a topic that is both timely and historical, and that is immigration, along with some other issues as well. The Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government seeks to preserve the legacy of Gordon Rosenmeier, who, along with his father before him, represented Crow Wing and Morrison counties in the Minnesota State Senate for almost 50 years. Gordon Rosenmeier achieved a legendary reputation by historians and political scientists as the single most powerful, most influential, and most respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. As our speaker for this last spring, we had a speaker here on the judiciary, Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Barry Anderson, and he said when he was here that no bill could become law without Rosenmeier's approval. That's quite saying something. Gordon Rosenmeier would have been pleased with tonight's speaker, Steve Young, who, like Gordon Rosenmeier, believes state government can be the key vehicle for implementing responsible public policy. Steve Young grew up in the diplomatic world of Southeast Asia. His father was U.S. ambassador to Thailand under President John F. Kennedy. He and his father knew well the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. That ambassador was Ellsworth Bunker, appointed by Lyndon Johnson to that position in the 1960s. Steve received his higher education at Harvard University and his law degree from Harvard University Law School. He has served as the dean of the Hamline University School of Law and is a national speaker on corporate social responsibility and business ethics. Mr. Young has also taught courses at the University of Minnesota Law School and the University of Minnesota's Carleton School of Business Management. Mr. Young is the CEO of the Co-Roundtable on Moral Capitalism, and his editorials have appeared in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, among others. Mr. Young is also author of several books, one of which is entitled Kissinger's Betrayal, and he is considered a national expert on the war in Vietnam. Finally, Mr. Young worked closely with President Carter, Vice President Mondale, and the Congress on the refugees crisis caused by the U.S. loss in the Vietnam War, and helped manage and facilitate the entree and assimilation of more than 60,000 refugees to Minnesota in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Mr. Young will speak on the topic, Immigration to Minnesota from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And students and visitors tonight can ask Mr. Young other questions that come up, and especially on the war in Vietnam as to why we lost it. It is my great privilege and honor to present to you Mr. Steve Young, our speaker for the Rosenmeier Forum tonight.
Worried about two mics. Both are on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out. What I'd like to do is tell you my story because I was kind of involved in all the refugees from Indochina coming to the United States, first in 1975 and then in 1978 through 1980. At the end of that, I would like to present you with a conclusion as to where this story of refugees from a war far away fits into the American story. But to start, I want to sort of quickly try to run through sort of my own story so you get a sense of who I am. And then after that, I'll tell you what I did, try to come up with a conclusion, and then we can open up for questions and discussion. But first, it occurred to me that where I want to end up begins with something that I participated in as a kid, or a college kid, and that was the civil rights movement. And I'm not sure how many of you remember any of the movement songs, because a couple of the movement songs when I was in college gave me a sense of what our country was all about. So if you don't mind, I'd like to play for you one of the ones that I found very meaningful. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Please.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let segregation, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let segregation, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no nervous Nelly, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no nervous Nelly, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let Chief Prince, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let Chief Prince, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, Lord, keep on talking, Lord, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let Mayor Kelly, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let Mayor Kelly, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, Lord, keep on talking, Lord, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no Uncle Tom, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no Uncle Tom, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody, Lord, turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom land.
So in 1965, with some friends, we flew down to Montgomery, Alabama, to join the end of the march from Selma. But anyway, Vietnam. So I'm an academic. I mean, I've written a number of books. Very briefly, the one on the left, Human Rights in Ancient China and Vietnam, written with my mentor, Professor Nguyen Ap Huy, who was a theoretician of Vietnamese nationalism. Secondly is a theory book on war. It's how an insurgency program was created to work with Vietnamese villagers. My dad wanted to do this in 1954, 55. It got done much later. That's a longer story. I tell it in the book. Bottom line is, from my point of view, the South Vietnamese in their villages, with the United States' help, defeated the communists, defeated the Viet Cong. Statistic, 1 million South Vietnamese were members of village self-defense forces. That's a big number. Then my question was, how come we lost? I ran across some documents when I was working with Ellsworth Bunker. I spent many years looking for more documents. My case is that Henry Kissinger, on his own, without authorization, from President Nixon, without telling anybody, decided to abandon the South Vietnamese. And then the last one, the Zenith, this is a translation of a Vietnamese book I did with my wife, who's Vietnamese, which is a novel which presents the facts about Ho Chi Minh, the famous Vietnamese leader. And it's a story that changes your understanding of Ho Chi Minh by 180 degrees. And she did this by using a novel format. So anyway, so my roots go back a long way in this country, right? On my mother's side, she was a Morris. Her ancestors were cousins of Lewis Morris. He signed the Declaration of Independence. His half-brother Gouverneur wrote the preamble to the Constitution. On my dad's side, we were descended from Winthrop Young, a reverend, who in April 1776 took the oath, the association oath to, quote, oppose with arms the operations of His Majesty's Army in the American colonies. So my dad was Kenneth Young. He participated as a staff person in the Geneva Conference, a picture on your right, which was held in 1954 in Geneva to end the French war in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. While he was there, the Secretary of State, Foster Dulles, made him head of Southeast Asian affairs. So from late 54 to 1958, he directed our policy in Vietnam. In particular, he wrote a letter for President Eisenhower to send to then Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam. This was the American commitment, which, and we can get into this in the discussion period, one, was completely overlooked by the anti-war movement for years, and two, was also completely overlooked by one Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense in the 60s, who therefore did not adopt a village-based, oriented, people-based program of counterinsurgency. What my dad put in Eisenhower's letter, I put in red. He focused on two things: the nationalist aspiration of the Vietnamese people themselves, and secondly, effective government performance. Here we are at the Gordon Rosenmeier Forum. Effective governance makes a difference. So this is a picture of my dad with Ngo Dinh Diem in 1958, the then president of South Vietnam. This is my dad presenting his credentials to the King of Thailand in 1961. 1965, when I was a Harvard undergraduate, I did some cultural anthropology for the Harvard Anthropology Department, spent all summer living in Zina Cantan in Chiapas, Mexico. I learned how to speak Tzotzil. My job there, because the Presidente Chep, he made me an honorary Mayol, a policeman. So it's my only direct experience with law enforcement. And we got to the fiesta day, and the morning he came out with this old Winchester rifle, which didn't work. There were no bullets, and the action didn't work. And I said, Chep, why are you giving this to me? He said, well, we're going to have a lot of drunk chamulas here, and you're taller than us, so they'll be more scared of you. So I had nightmares about some American guy, getting into trouble because I beat up some chamula or something like that. Anyway, so the next summer I did anthropology, field anthropology in Thailand. I learned the Thai language when Dad was ambassador. Right by this tree in late 1966, the path was narrow then. I was walking down there with a guy with the hat, Siripong, and I wasn't looking at what I was doing. I was talking to him, and I tripped over a tree root, fell on my face in the dirt, and discovered a Bronze Age culture. And those are some shards I brought back to Bangkok. Ban Chiang is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Those shards are anywhere from 200 Common Era back to maybe 600. The earliest remains in the site are about 2000 BC. So that's me planting rice. Okay, this is the March from Selma. I'm somewhere in the crowd towards the front on the right-hand side. Now, another story, which sort of does get to me, was in 1966, I saved Robert McNamara from the SDS protesters at Harvard. I may take a minute to describe this to you. It was sort of an unexpected thing. McNamara had been invited to come to Harvard to have some private talks with faculty members and some classes, but no public discussion of the Vietnam War. The SDS organization demanded that he meet with them to answer their questions about the war in Vietnam. Was it right? Was it just? Could we win? All those kinds of things. The guy who was running the program a guy by the name of Barney Frank, whom some of you may have heard of because he became a very famous congressman later on. Barney was working for the nascent Kennedy Institute. Barney had sort of been my tutor, and we were friends. So McNamara was going to have lunch at my college house, Quincy House. So Barney calls me up and says, Steve, I need your help. I basically said, sure, Barney, whatever you want. He says, well, McNamara is going to be at Quincy House, and SDS is going to have a big demonstration, and we got to get McNamara. We got to smuggle him out of the house some way. So I need your help. Your job is to be a decoy for McNamara, to sit in the back seat of the car and drive out, and the SDS guys will chase you. And I'm thinking, okay, Barney. I happen to know that Mike and Sarah and a couple of other guys who were some of the leaders of SDS. So that's what happened. I sat in the back seat of the car. Garage door goes up. We drive out. The guy who was driving, Graham Allison, I'll tell you about him in a second. So we turn right. We go down the street. And there's another street coming in to my right. As I look this way, I see that the car in which McNamara is in, because he's come out a side door over there, he gets into an unmarked, sort of just an ordinary car, and there's a student standing in front of the car. Some of you may remember the classic image in Beijing of Tiananmen, where there's one Chinese guy standing in front of a tank, right? And the tank isn't moving. So this guy, I had no idea who he was, he's standing there, and I look at that. I know the plan is not going to work. Something's wrong. I say, Graham, stop the car. We got a problem. So I get out and walk over, and Graham takes off. Graham Allison later writes a very famous book about the Cuban Missile Crisis and becomes the dean of the Kennedy School of Government. But on that particular afternoon, he took off. So I go over to the car. McNamara is sitting in the back. This is Secretary of Defense, right? And it's just the student, the car, McNamara, and me, and I'm not quite sure what to do. And all of a sudden, Hal Benenson and some of the SDS guys come running around this way, and McNamara, he doesn't know how to, he doesn't know what to do, what to say. The face doesn't, you know, the situation is beyond him. So I go over to Hal, and I say, Hal, what do you guys want? He said, Steve, look, we just want to ask the secretary some questions. So I go back, McNamara rolls down the window. I say, Mr. Secretary, would you mind answering some questions? He says, no, that's fine. So he gets out, and then pretty soon there are like 200 to 300 SDS students in this narrow street between two buildings. And so I can't remember who thought of it. It might have been me. So put McNamara on top of the car, because Mike and Sarah had a microphone thing. So McNamara is standing on top of the car. And I crawl up behind him, and I'm the guy bending over next to McNamara's left. And as McNamara gets up on top of the car, I'm crawling up. I hear him say, oh, and by the way, he writes all about this in his book. And he stands up there and he sort of says to the crowd, bunch of college students, right? When I was your age, I was twice as tough and much better. And I'm crawling up and I sort of say, Mr. Secretary, I don't think that's so wise. You know, there are 2 of us and 200 of them. But anyway, so I climb up there, and McNamara takes a few questions. And then, as I remember, I thought I was standing on this other side. But anyway, I'm standing there, and it's kind of like this force of blue all of a sudden comes out of the crowd right up at us and pushes me and McNamara back off the car, where we're caught by some other people. The Cambridge police had arrived, and they had infiltrated the crowd, and so they push us off. The police surround us and take us into the doorway behind McNamara's head, which is Leverett House. So we get inside. There's a little entryway there, and there's 3 cops, McNamara and me. And the sergeant turns to me and says, "What do we do now?" And my reaction was, "You're asking me? I mean, I'm a civilian here, you know." But then I realized that if we can't come up with a good plan, this is going to turn into a huge mess, right? For the Secretary of Defense, for Harvard University, worst comes to worst, SDS will do these things. Cambridge cops will come by the dozens. They'll start, you know, hitting students. This is not what anybody wants. I suddenly remember, I recognize the door behind the sergeant. I'm looking at McNamara standing here, sergeant's there, 2 cops here, and there's a door. By coincidence, I remembered that door leads down into the tunnels underneath all the Harvard houses are tunnels connected to the main kitchen and the different dining rooms in the different houses. My roommate, Ned Fetcher, worked for the kitchens. Ned was also a mountain climber and a spelunker, and he had taken me through the tunnels. So I then turned to the secretary and I said, Mr. Secretary, where's your next appointment? And he fumbles in here and comes up with a sheet and he says, I can't remember, I think it was Langdale Hall or something like that. And so I asked the sergeant, I said, Sergeant, can you get a taxi? He said, yeah, I can get a taxi. I said, so Sergeant, have a taxi come to the back of Kirkland House where the loading dock is and pick up the secretary there. I will take the secretary through the tunnels to the loading dock, which is what I did. So I lead the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, through the tunnels underneath the Harvard houses. So we get to Kirkland House, we go up, I open the door like this, total quiet, no SDS people anywhere, and then I open the door wide, and then McNamara strides right past me, goes down, and as if nothing had happened, and I follow him. He goes out, opens up the door of the taxi, gets in, and one, doesn't say thank you, and two, doesn't ask my name. But the lesson I took from that somehow is when you gotta do something important, you do it, okay? Okay, so I was in Vinlong in the Villages, 1968 to 1969, Vinlong province. Those are the other guys in the advisory team. These are some Vietnamese village troops. The guy in the middle is Colonel Nia, the province chief, very famous. We became good friends. This is a Cambodian village there. My apologies. But the Buddhist statues and images in this village, from my point of view, really not very pretty. So on one trip to Bangkok, I bought, I thought, a more elegant one and presented it to the temple. Bill Colby, then, who was later head of the CIA, moved me to Saigon to make me a bureaucrat. As a bureaucrat, I came up with programs to apply to every one of the 2,200 villages in South Vietnam during the 1971 operation. This is building out local government at the village level, underneath district and province. This is the theory we used, right? You decentralize power to village government. You use village development and the people participate. So decentralization and participation work like yin and yang. They reinforce each other. If you decentralize power, you generate participation. If you generate participation, you can decentralize power because people will use it and use it well. A friend of mine I later got to know, Professor Wee of the Tung Dai Viet Party, he actually had a theory in 2 volumes called Yung Tap Shin Tom, which means Vietnamese nest. And I cultivated him when I was moved up to Saigon. I put the word here, nationalism, Vietnamese national, because that's the very word my dad used in 1954 about why we Americans should support the Vietnamese, because they have their own values and their own culture, as a picture of Professor Wee. And his philosophy in those books, I've got copies here. The Constitution of 1967, all this stuff was ignored by our journalists, by the anti-war movement, had checks and balances, regular elections at village, provincial, and national levels, decentralized power to the villages. The Vietnamese phrase was tu tri, tu tu, tu phum. And this is what Dad was thinking about. If you're going to defeat communist insurgency, you need to trust the people and give them power. So I got married. So these are my 2 best men. Now the guy on the left, that's Parker Borg, born and raised in Wayzata, Minnesota. He will become very important to the story in a little bit. That's Ambassador Bunker at our wedding reception, Colonel Nia at our wedding reception. Okay, I'm now going to turn to the story. 1975. This is the house that we bought on Union Street in Brooklyn. And on Sunday, March 30th, 1975, Wah, myself, 2 of our kids, and a Thai artist friend were there painting, because we had to fix up an old house, right? And we had the radio on playing music. 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the music is interrupted. Announcement says, flash, important story from Vietnam. The city of Da Nang, which is in central Vietnam, has been taken over by the communists. And I lost it. because I knew if the general there, General Ngo Quang Trung, was the best general in the Vietnamese army, if he could not hold Da Nang, there's no hope. President Thieu had already given orders to withdraw the main forces from the top part of South Vietnam. I can answer more about that in the questions. That's my first thought. My second thought is communists are going to take over. My third thought is a whole lot of people are going to be, what should I say, ladies and gentlemen, in deep shit, right? Arrest, punishment, concentration camps, re-education, kids won't be able to go to school, confiscation of property. I mean, and we're talking a couple of million South Vietnamese, right? There are 800,000 in the army, 200,000 police, all the village chiefs, all the members of the village council whom we'd empowered, they're all on the blacklist of the communists, and all my wife's family. So the next thought was, how do I get my wife's family out? My next thought was, well, yeah, that's just one family. I mean, we've got tens of thousands of families whose lives are going to be very badly affected by the communists. Then I remembered 1956, okay? Some of you may recall in 1956 there had been sort of an uprising and a political change in Hungary against the Russians. The Russians then sent in troops and they crushed it, but I don't know, something like 100,000 plus Hungarians left and got over to Austria. We had a refugee program in 1956 for Hungarians, and one of them, a girl by the name of Judith, ended up in my 6th grade class in Washington, D.C., where she was befriended by my best friend, Peter Batzel. But in 6th grade, you know, this boy-girl thing is a little bit sort of awkward. So Peter's deal was he would come to my house after school and get me, and then he and I would go to the house where Judith and her mother were staying with a sponsor family, and I would sit in the living room, and Peter and Judith would go out to the backyard. So but I remembered refugees, Judith. So then I said, we need a refugee program. Then I remembered the guy I just told you about, Parker Borg, who was my best man. Parker was then the staff guy to Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State. So I said, done deal. I will go to Washington, I will talk to Parker, and we'll get a refugee program started. Quite naive. Anyway, the next day I didn't go to work at Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett. I went to Washington. Stayed at my grandmother's house, called Parker up, said, Parker, I need your help. And he said, I can't help you, Steve. And I dumbfounded. I mean, we were good friends. We studied Vietnamese together, you know. I said, Parker, you got to help me. I mean, we need a refugee program. He said, I resigned on Friday. I said, you what? I said, yeah, I resigned as Kissinger's staff aide. I can't stand the man. He's a really bad man. And then he told me a couple of things, and I'll try to do it really quickly. So I said, so Parker's job, because in those days you didn't have recording machines. Every time Kissinger would make a phone call, Parker would listen in on another phone and make notes. So there was a record of who said what. So he describes this where Henry would sort of get on the phone and he'd call some big shot and say, Jim, this is Henry. You know, I really shouldn't be telling you this, but Jim, you are one of the most important people in this administration. I admire you so much. I just can't keep it from you. After we left the National Security meeting, Roger said your idea is full of shit. You're like, what? Roger said that? Well, Jim, I don't know. Please don't tell this to anybody else. Hang up. Right? Next phone call is to Roger. Right? Okay. And Parker's taking notes. So Henry says, Roger, this is Henry. You know, I don't think I should be telling you this, but I was just in a conversation with Jim, and he thinks you're just not helpful to the administration. I don't know why he doesn't like you. Roger goes, what, Henry? I didn't know that. Well, no, don't tell anybody that I told you this. So Kissinger would spend his time turning people against each other so that he could walk right through the middle and get done what he wanted to do. And then Parker said, look, Steve, you know, Kissinger doesn't give, excuse my French, doesn't give a shit about the South Vietnamese. Ford wants the Vietnam War to go away. You can't get it done. And then he paused a moment and they said, well, we can talk to Lionel Rosenblatt, another friend from Vietnam, who was the staff aide to the Deputy Secretary of State. So Parker said, let's go talk to Lionel tonight. So that night, Monday night, Parker and I went over to Lionel's house, Porter Street or something off Connecticut Avenue, down past the zoo. And Lionel didn't turn the lights on. He brought out 3 snifters of brandy. Parker was in a funk because he probably just torpedoed his career by resigning on Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger holds grudges, does not treat people nicely who get in his way. And Lionel was also saying, Steve, it's no way. I mean, there's no energy here. There's no, you know. But then Lionel said, wait a moment, Steve. Tomorrow at lunch, a bunch of the guys are getting together. Those of us civilians who'd worked in courts in the embassy and things like that. We've been meeting, you know, every Tuesday to follow the situation in Vietnam. Why don't you come by and make a pitch? So I said, okay. So the next day, Tuesday lunch, I show up to State Department. Turns out the meeting's in Henry Kissinger's office. So Lionel and Parker come out as I'm walking in, and they say, Steve, you can't come in. You can't come to the meeting. I said, why not? They said, well, because you're a civilian. You don't have a top secret clearance anymore. And Al Adams, who's another assistant to Kissinger, Al said that if you're in the meeting, he won't be there. So I said, okay, guys, I get it. Al is much more important than me. But I'm counting on the two of you. Get something going. So anyway, so I left, walked around for about an hour, came back, came to the same place. Parker and Lionel happened to come out as I'm waiting there, smiles on their faces. Everybody agrees. That was the start of the program, and we now have something like 2 million Americans who've come from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And it all started that way. Next story, then I'll move on. I came back to Washington a week later just to kind of provide a little bit of encouragement, and walked into Lionel in his office, and he's on the phone with somebody. And I'm sitting over here, and he's talking away, and they're clearly talking about refugees coming over and this and that. And all of a sudden, Lionel puts his hand over the speaker of the old-fashioned telephone and says, Steve, how many refugees are we going to have to take? And I said, Lionel, I mean, a million North Vietnamese came south in '55 to flee the communists. They'd have kids. They've got grandkids. There are 1 million men in the Army. They've got wives and children. There are a couple 100,000 here. There's all the village chiefs. I said, 2 million. And he shook his head like this and went back on the phone, had some conversation, and then he hung up. And he said, Steve, I was just talking to Teddy Kennedy's staff aide on refugees. Okay, in those days, you couldn't have a visa. I mean, within 3 weeks, there'd be no U.S. embassy. Where are Vietnamese going to get visas to come to the United States? Oh, and by the way, what airplane are they going to take, or what boat are they going to take to get to the United States? So you need something else. There was a program then, and by the way, it's come back to us with the border issue under President Biden. It's called parole. The parole is you don't have a visa, you don't have a legal right to come to the United States, but you've got some special concern. You can be paroled in. You give your word to be a good person. We allow you to come to the United States, and then you can start doing the paperwork, right? But the parole authority has to be approved by the Senate. Because under the Constitution, immigration is not an executive function. And Teddy Kennedy was then the chair of the Senate Immigration Committee, and he had to approve. So Lionel is negotiating with Teddy's staff aide, and Kennedy's position was that we would take in 1975 the same number of South Vietnamese that we had taken in 1965 from Cuba. Some of you may remember the Muriel boat lift, right, where Castro sent a whole bunch of people out, and we took them, and they ended up in Miami. 150,000. And so Lionel said, Steve, you're not going to like this, but the number is 150,000. And he was right. I mean, I was really ticked. But 150,000 is better than 0. So I said, what can I do? So we had permission to take 150,000 Vietnamese in 1975. 130,000 actually made it here, and then that was it. However, Vietnamese in particular started leaving Vietnam by sea, the so-called boat people. And their ships, they would be robbed by Thai pirates, the women would be raped, they'd run out of food, people died on the ocean. The Thais didn't want to take them, the Malaysians didn't want to take them. Hmong started to leave Laos because the communists were just after them. They'd come across the river, some would get through, some would get shot by the Thais. They were put in a camp called Ban Vinai. Nobody left Cambodia, or very few people left. Pol Pot with the Khmer Rouge killed, I don't know, 1.5 million, 2 million people out of a population of 5 million. I want to talk about that a little bit. So another guy who'd served in Vietnam, Chep Lohman, he called up a guy, Leo Chern, who was head of the International Rescue Committee. Leo put together a team called the Citizens Commission for Indo-Chinese Refugees, and he asked me to join. There were about 6 or 7 of us. We went out to the camps in Thailand. I'll tell you a couple of stories. Anyway, then came back to America, met with people in the Carter administration and the Congress. At this point, Teddy Kennedy was faced with human tragedy. He was a little bit more open. And that led to the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980, under which all refugees have come to the United States since. Under the Refugee Act of 1980, the Vietnamese boat people, survivors of the killing fields in Cambodia, and all the Hmong, right, all came out. And then later on, there were other programs, and I think most of the Somalis who live in Minnesota now also came under the Refugee Act, plus some other people. So let me just tell you 2 stories about the Cambodians, because my concern is that they are the ones who are most in need and are the most ignored, because they haven't really sort of emerged. The Hmong are, they're running for office. They get elected to office. St. Paul, Vietnamese. We have millionaire Vietnamese, even some here. But you go to the Vietnamese places in Houston, Dallas, Southern California. I mean, it's incredibly successful over the last 50 years. But the Cambodians, the Khmer. So one story personally, and 2 from the camps. My wife, we had one of our houses in St. Paul had a kind of mother-in-law apartment in the basement. And so Wah ran into a camp. She was working with refugees. A Cambodian lady, Sui Hien, who had a daughter, Piri. Husband dead, 3 other children dead. But the mother and Piri had survived, made it out here. And so Wah said to Sui Hien, why don't you just rent? Stay with us, rent with us. And so we would hear Sui Hien to her daughter's face. Piri was then maybe 18, something like that, I don't know. And quite frankly, Piri was not the smartest young lady you will ever meet. And then her mother would say to her face in front of us, I don't understand what happened. Why am I stuck with my stupid daughter? Where is my brilliant, handsome son? Okay. So one day we're sitting in the front of the house in the yard, and Sui Hien tends to be there. She's standing there. Car comes down, squeaks to a stop, turns in the driveway. A Cambodian guy gets out and starts talking to Sui Hien, and she goes over and they talk, and then he gets back in the car and they drive off. She turns around and tells my wife, she said, I hate that guy. When I jumped off the boat in order to kill myself, he jumped in and rescued me. I will never forgive him. Now think about a mental state. Okay, stories from I learned in the camps. So what the Khmer Rouge cadres would tell people, the Khmer Rouge had a theoretical division of the people between the old population and the new population. Old population, they had indoctrinated. You could live. If you belonged to the new population, which meant you lived in a city, you wore glasses, you were educated, and you had light-colored skin, which means you were either Chinese or Vietnamese. What they would say to you is, if you live, we gain nothing. If you die, we lose nothing. So why not kill you today? Number is north of 1 million. I went to one of the camps in Chantaburi. I was there with an interpreter, in Vin, and the refugees are just sitting in sort of thatch shacks, huts here. The hills up there, that's the Cambodian border. The Khmer Rouge soldiers are up there. We're down here. I look over here, there's a little building with a little sort of porch with a sloped roof with palm fronds on it, and there's a guy sitting there in an orange robe. Buddhist monk. So I go over there and talk to him through Im Vin, who speaks English. And I ask him, I said, so what is the situation with Buddhism in Cambodia? He goes like this. I said, and the monks? He said, all dead. I said, and the scriptures? All burned. And the temples? Well, those that have not been converted into schools have been destroyed. So I'm thinking, here is, a regime which has wiped out this religion while it's been killing people. It's the Cambodian side. Then driving back to Bangkok, Im Vin told me that he and his wife and I think 2 kids forced to leave Phnom Penh, sent out to the countryside to a village where they do hard labor. One day, everybody in the village is ordered to show up at the schoolhouse. So they all go to the schoolhouse. They're crowded inside. A truck comes up. There's a sort of probably a military truck, cargo truck, and a bunch of people are ordered to get in the truck. Truck drives off. Half an hour, 40 minutes later, truck comes back, empty. Everybody knows what's going to happen. This is their day to die. So Im Vin turns to his wife, right, and says, I will not let them kill me like a dog. I will do something. I must do something. I cannot die like a dog. I'm going to run away. And his wife turns to him and says, if we meet again on the other side, will you marry me again? And he said, of course. And then he climbs out the window, spends 7 days walking to Thailand, gets through minefields, and his wife and kids are killed. The Khmer in Minnesota, even the ones who come up here, if you have those kinds of experiences for you and your family and others, for me, it's very hard to figure out how do you live well having gone through something like that. So I'm particularly concerned and feel grateful that we took the Khmer. So, what's my conclusion from this? I think the story of, well, sorry, one more point. If you look at, and by the way, some of the statistics are very hard to find. If you look at the income statistics for all different kinds of Americans, particularly median family income, you will see that the Vietnamese and the Khmer, and particularly the Hmong, well, no, sorry, the Vietnamese and the Hmong have higher median family incomes than white Americans. The Khmer and the Lao are lower. The people with the highest incomes the other day are South Asian Americans, Taiwanese Americans, Filipino Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Singaporean Americans, Pakistani Americans, Korean Americans. Their annual median family income is almost double for the average, for the median for whites. The Hmong family income is higher, even the Hmong. But this is family income. It's because the Hmong live generationally. My wife, the other year, she was giving taking a present to Nancy Vang, who worked in her office, and Nancy just had a little baby, so we're giving a present to the baby. And I have an address. I don't know how many of you guys know the area around St. Paul, but the address is in Woodbury. Okay, Woodbury's a suburb, and in those days, median price, $300,000, $350,000 a house. I mean, it's not cheap housing, right? So I'm driving down the street looking for this address. I see that it's, and we're going to a section with very nice big houses, big yards, nice trees. Turn left into a cul-de-sac, and I see a house with 4 cars in the driveway. And I say, that's the house. 4 cars, 4 families. So in that house, which Nancy's mother and father own, there's the mother and father, I think 2 or 3 children and daughters-in-law and son-in-law and a bunch of grandchildren. They're all contributing income to the family. The grandmother is babysitting the kids, so all the young people can work. So even if a young Hmong guy is without much education, is only making $17,000, $20,000 a year, you multiply that by 5 or 6, and then the grandmother and the women are doing vegetable farming during the summer, and they're going to make another $15,000, $20,000. You put all that together, you have, you can get by. So what is my conclusion from all this? I think the refugee story that I've just told you, just hinted at, tells us something important about who we are as Americans. One point, and I'm treading on difficult, sensitive stuff these days in our culture, in our history. Because with one exception, all the people who made the refugee effort possible were white and male. The one exception was Bayard Rustin. I don't know if any of you remember the name. I mean, Bayard was the guy who organized the 1963 March on Washington, behind the scenes. And the other year, President Obama made a movie about Bayard, which I saw, which I spent hours sitting next to Bayard on the flight across the Pacific in '78. I mean, he stood out to me as a human being and as an American. And we welcome these people. We didn't have to do it. Kissinger turned his back. And they have contributed. So I think there's something in this refugee story, and right here in Minnesota, which we as Americans, we ought to look at that and say, yeah, not everybody is a good person. But there are a lot of good people in America. And fundamentally, I think, this is a good country. But it takes work to be good and to have a good country. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll take some questions if you guys have any.
Anybody? Yes?
Hang on one second, we're gonna use the mic, because otherwise it doesn't get sent or recorded. Ron? Hello? No,
I've got an extra mic here. You want to use that?
back up, I got back. Try that. You assured me that they worked. Hello? Testing 1, 2, testing, there we go.
Kissinger is the only one who knows for sure, but what is your belief? Why would Kissinger want the Vietnam War to end the way it did?
Okay, conscious of time. First of all, I have not found, and I don't know of anybody who's found anything in writing where Kissinger laid out his reasons. I just haven't found it. I can speculate as to why. He's a very, very smart man, and you don't want to leave any evidence. 1. 2, in his memoirs, he writes a lot about a Frenchman, a French guy by the name of Jean Saint-Denis, whom nobody remembers. Anybody who knows Vietnamese history and things like that, when I first saw that name, I spoke French, right? Jean Saint-Denis in 1946 was the French colonial official who picked Ho Chi Minh to be the leader of the Vietnamese people in an agreement signed on March 6, 1946, a copy of which I had, which anti-war movement, all our academics, our journalists have totally overlooked and forgotten about. Okay. Kissinger in his memoirs said basically, Saint-Denis understood the Vietnamese, the difficulties, the complexity, the truth about Vietnam. He's got a sentence or two in a couple of places. He also, all right, we'll get there. He then would indicate that he tended to, in his memoirs, he tended to sympathize more with Saint-Denis. He took Saint-Denis as his teacher, if you will, as the person who could tell him the truth about Vietnam. Not the American military, not the CIA, not all this, right? Saint-Denis was the son-in-law of Albert Sarraut, who was the French Governor General of Indochina in 1920. His second wife, however, had been a student of Henry Kissinger's at Harvard in 1950. Kissinger in the early 60s is using Saint-Denis as a channel to the North Vietnamese communists, so he could then promote himself vis-a-vis Nelson Rockefeller and other Americans as a man who could work out a deal on Vietnam. One of the documents I found by accident, and I found a number of documents by accident, which makes you suddenly wonder, was it an accident? There's something else going on. It was a memorandum of conversation in the White House, May 25, 1971. Formerly top secret, declassified now. Participants, Dr. Henry A. Kissinger, Mr. and Mrs. Jean-Paul Santini, Brigadier General Alexander Haig, Dick Smizer, Win Lord, who's a friend of mine, luncheon May 25. Vietnam, Mr. Santini said that. Hanoi does not fully believe that the Americans will leave Vietnam. If they were assured of that and of a certain number of seats for the NLF in the Assembly, they would come to terms on returning our POWs, a ceasefire, and the separation of the two Vietnams for a number of years, which is what Kissinger called in his meeting with Zhou Enlai later, a decent interval. So Kissinger proposed first to the Russians, January 9, 1971, two things. Hanoi can leave its army in the north, in the south. We're not going to, you know, they're an invading, conquering army. They just leave it in the south. And 2 years, they have to give South Vietnam 2 years after a peace treaty. Then they can do any damn thing they please. And the winner takes all. And he said that to the Russians, who then told Hanoi, and then he told it separately to China, and nobody's ever found these documents. President Nixon had no idea. President Nixon only learned about this when I told him in 1989, and he turned white. I put that in the book. I think Kissinger bought the notion from Santini. He thought the French were smarter. They knew the Vietnamese, that the good Vietnamese were French educated. And all the communist leaders were French educated. Communism came from France. It didn't come from Vietnam. There's no Marxist-Leninism in any of the Vietnamese villages there for the last 3,000 years, right? Huh? So Kissinger does that. Now he's got a problem. He thinks, therefore, the American war cannot be won, and those South Vietnamese don't deserve anything. So he works out this deal that Nixon gets peace with honor on a piece of paper, and Hanoi gets to win the war.
All right, who else? All right, hang on.
Oh, I got a deep voice, I don't need to speak that close. What were some of the main challenges faced when immigrants immigrated to Minnesota?
Okay, I'll share a story with you for the Hmong, because it varies, as I tried to indicate with the Cambodians, by the different people, their different experiences. The Cambodians, I think, were maybe, and I have many Cambodian friends, so I hope it's okay if I say this, in some sort of psychological sense, maybe, they really are victims. In some psychological sense, okay? The Hmong don't have that, but the Hmong were hill people. Their language had never been written down. They came here, they were what they call pre-literate. They couldn't read and write, they didn't do math. The men did what? They were hunters and they were soldiers. The women, they raised babies, they cooked, they did beautiful embroidery, and they grew vegetables. And now you've got everybody, you're living in public housing in St. Paul. What are you going to do? You don't speak English? How are you going to get a job? So anyway, so the story is on this. I think the answer for the Hmong is leadership. It came from General Vang Pao, and who was the Hmong leader during the war and afterwards over here. So, and I'd met Vang Pao before. When we moved out here in 1980, I came out to take a job. I ran into one Hmong guy, somehow I can't remember, Vang Sa, who said, "Oh, Steve, VP is going to give a talk at Central High School in St. Paul to the elders, and why don't you come?" I said, "Sure." So I show up. I don't speak Hmong. But I could sort of tell, there was tension. You had an auditorium 3 times the size of this, filled with Hmong men, the elders. VP is up here, I'm sort of sitting over there. And VP's trying to persuade them. Like we're here, we got to do this, I could tell that. So afterwards, Saab invites me to a house, Li Teng's house. Li Teng was a very important aide to VP. He had a small house in South Minneapolis. So I show up there. And the house is filled with again, Hmong elders, very small house. And I just sense, the people are just, tension isn't the right word, despondency isn't the right word, lost. They're just kind of, And so I asked Li Teng, who speaks good English, I said, "Li Teng, I have a sense people are something's wrong here." He said, oh yeah, Steve. He said, they're terrified. What happens if VP should die? Who's going to take care of him? Who are they going to talk to? Who's going to solve the problems? So I sort of felt, and go back to the story I told you earlier, you got to do something. So I said to VP, I said, 10-night poem, may I say something? And he said, sure, Steve, say something. So I said, all right. So I stood and I looked at everybody and I said, you know, I understand that, you know, we're all concerned. The 10-night poem may die. And you know, he will die. And everybody goes like this. The VP looks at me like, Steve, where are you going? And I said, yeah, you know, and I'm going to die. And you're going to die. And you're going to die. Why do we pay attention to that? Why don't we focus on what do we do when we're alive? Now you're all here. You're all leaders. You've got housing. You've got sponsors. There are churches who care about you. There's this and that. Now, my recommendation is two things. One, first, work. Don't worry about what the job is. If you can't speak English, get a job that doesn't require speaking English. Take your time to learn English. Second thing, education for the children. Focus on education. Take a long-term view. Don't worry about 6 months or 1 year. Ask yourself about your kids. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Then it occurred to me that nobody in this room, including General Van Pau, had any idea about Norwegians, Swedes, African Americans, Germans. You know, the whole thing about people coming over here without much assets, without not even speaking English. And look what happened for almost everyone, right? We have two actually, major exceptions. But for others, what happens? They didn't even know the history. So then I started talking a bit about the history. But what the Hmong did, and I think it was both VP and it's in the Hmong, they have focused on work and education. Those of you go, there are two huge private Hmong, in effect, charter high schools in St. Paul. I mean, huge. And they were founded by other people, but supported by the Hmong clan leaders to do what? To produce Hmong lawyers, doctors, nurses, professors, teachers, boom, 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 boom. And after 50 years, what do they have? They have lawyers, doctors, teachers, politicians, people who have jobs, white-collar jobs. They work for foundations. They've got college degrees. That's how they approached it. I come back very briefly to the Khmer. They haven't done that. And so, as I said earlier, I worry about them.
All right, who's next? Gary?
Thanks for coming. If the communist ideology came from the French, how come the North Vietnamese fought against them to get them out of the country?
Very good question. Right at the heart of the last 80 years. And not everybody, Vietnamese or American, is going to agree with me. My sense is that the model for the Vietnamese Communist Party at the end of World War II was the model created by Stalin in 39 or 40 in order to fight Hitler, which was the notion of an alliance. And Stalin flipped the legitimacy of his regime in 40-41 after Hitler invaded from communism to Russianism. So the phrase I think they used was united front. So what the communists in Vietnam did, because they had a very tiny party, I once saw a statistic like 25,000 people. At the same time, there's a religious guy down in the Mekong Delta, Wen Fushou. He's got a couple of 100,000 people following his religion, the Wahao religion. Now, of course, in 1947, the communists murdered him. But so the communists, they have the inner. They then create a united front. And the purpose of the united front was to kick the French out. The person they put forward to lead the front was Ho Chi Minh. who talks like a nationalist, who doesn't talk like a communist. The communists are all hidden. In 47 or 48, they send the Communist Party underground. It becomes a series of Marxist-Leninist study groups. It doesn't reemerge until 49 or 50 after the communists after Mao Zedong has won in China. So the communists, and this, by the way, this is going on in Hanoi today with the new leader, Do Lam. Are we Vietnamese or are we communists? How can you be a Vietnamese and a communist? And the debate is now sort of more than percolating. I think the answer is it was a very successful tactic because most Vietnamese would say, I'm a Vietnamese first and I'll worry about the communists later. Let's get rid of the French. So they would be willing to cooperate with the Viet Minh, with Ho Chi Minh to get rid of the French. The issue then comes when they get rid of the French, 54, 55, at the Geneva conference where my dad was. So what are you going to do? People realize you've got Vietnam, you know, you got maybe a third of the people with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. You got another third of the people who are Catholics and landlords and others who just can't stand, and you got about another third or more who are looking this way and that, saying, I don't like either of these guys. So the Chinese, as I remember, they came up with the model of Germany and Korea. You cut the country in two. There's one half for the communists to run, and there's another half for the non-communists to run. And that was accepted by the French and imposed on the Vietnamese with an unsigned document called the Geneva Accords, which said there should be fair elections in 1956. Of course, when you get to 1956, the Russians said, we don't care. I mean, my dad wrote about that. That wasn't, the Russians did not want elections in Vietnam in 1956 because they didn't want a precedent for elections in Korea or elections in Germany. So you now have two separate states. A new guy comes to power in 1959, Lê Duẩn, and he gets the Communist Party in January 59 to adopt a resolution to conquer South Vietnam. But his strategy is different from the North Koreans. His strategy is not to invade across a border. His strategy is to send cadres into Laos and into South Vietnam and mobilize cadres in the villages against the Americans. The argument was that the Americans were imperialists, just like the French. And in fact, one time I was in a village, it was near Phu Quoc in Tam Binh, and I'd gone out there with a music team and sort of lectures to the people, and there'd been a dust-up, some shooting over there, and some guy comes up, villagers, because I speak Vietnamese, and it's pretty clear to me this guy's a sympathizer, a communist, or something like that. And he starts going after me as, why are you Americans here? What do you want? Where are you going to exploit us? And I said, excuse me, sir, do you have any evidence that we Americans have ever asked for one bag of rice? Have we ever asked for một lương vàng, a gold bar? I said, by the way, do you also know how many hundreds of millions of piastres we've used American money to come and help, the guy's going like this. And then I had my ace. Right at that time, there was a big road, not 5 kilometers farther away, which was being totally rebuilt by an American engineering battalion. Very nice. I mean, this is the Mekong Delta. It's like 600 feet of mud. In order to get a road that's going to work, you got to put various levels of gravel and sand and this and this and this. So these guys are out there working their butts off to build a nice new road for the Vietnamese. And at this point, we're surrounded by a whole bunch of villagers. And it's pretty clear to me who they were rooting for. And it wasn't the other guy. But the argument was, we came over here to build a road. And we're building a road, and then we're going to leave. So the argument that worked for some Vietnamese is that we Americans, being white folks, and we're just like the French, other white folks. One of the things that's happened in the interim, which has led to the current malaise or difficulty for the true communists in Vietnam, are the refugees in America. The Vietnamese inside Vietnam know that there are Vietnamese millionaires, dollar millionaires by the hundreds in America. So where is this American white racism, superiority, imperialism, things like that? The Americans actually opened up to Vietnamese. Did we make a mistake? That's the argument that's kind of going on the internet and things like that. Where it goes, I can't predict. I have my hopes, but I can't predict. I don't know if that's helpful to you or.
All right, right up here.
Thank you. This is very interesting. A couple of us, Buford and Diane, Rhoda and I, we're involved in a lot of Rotary kind of mission work in Persat, Cambodia. So if there are people who are interested in helping the Cambodians, because I couldn't agree with you more, and I have my perception of why they've struggled more, and it's because, you know, Pol Pot was such an insane, evil person. He literally wanted to wipe anything and everything that was Cambodian out. And I think when that happens and you lose all your loved ones in the process as well, who are you? You're sort of a shell of who you were. So it's a terrible situation. The good news, though, is the people that we're working with in Persat, which is one of the poorest areas, are just incredibly hardworking, amazing values. I mean, you would want them as your neighbor anywhere you live, and so they're actually doing quite well with the kinds of things that we're doing, more grassroots. But I was thinking back, though, to your comments about Vietnam, and our daughter's from Thailand, and she's befriended a lot of people from that area. Her best friend is actually Vietnamese, Lucy. I had a chance to spend a little time in Vietnam and visit with her parents, who are physicians, and spent some time. This was in the, you know, they call it Ho Chi Minh, but Saigon, and I was overwhelmed by how much everyone I met loved Americans. And in the case of Lucy, I mean, both her and her daughter are over here studying, sister studying over here, and so there is, and I also was blown away by, this is a communist country, and they are so capitalist. I mean, business is everywhere over there, and of course, as you talked about, all the success with the Vietnamese who are here. So I'm kind of bullish on Vietnam if we can continue to have good relationships with them, which, as you know, there's all the POWs that went back and have had a favor. But what concerns me is when Buford, Diane, and Rhoda and I are in Cambodia, there are these big, beautiful roads that are being created, and they're all being funded by the Chinese. And the Chinese are basically want to keep the Cambodians at a subsistence farming level. They don't care about education and entrepreneurial, you know, economic development. They're taking the raw ingredients that they produce, like the rice, they process it along with fruits and other things, and then they bring it back into Cambodia so that they can make a big profit. And then this country goes and has high tariffs on Cambodians and Vietnamese, and they talk about reciprocity. And think, how do you have reciprocity when these folks, the GDP per person, you know, was 1,400 when the U.S. was 68,000, Thailand was 14,000, and Vietnam was 7,000. I mean, this is one of the poorest nations in the world, and so I don't know what the future is. I'd be interested. I know you've been focusing more now on the past, but I'd be interested in what you think the future might be. And as someone who worked in healthcare, and we know the demographics in this country, anyone in this room who is middle-aged and think they're going to get good healthcare as they get older, we have amazingly projected all the shortages of doctors and nurses, we don't have the demographics to care even for ourselves long term. So this country has to import people. We need people desperately to come in to staff all these great jobs that we have. We don't have enough Americans unless we have a massive baby boom, which the demographics suggest otherwise. So I'm just curious, for you, if you were to look into the future, how do you see those countries, you know, the Thai and I don't know Laos as well, but especially Vietnam and Cambodia, how could things play out longer term for us?
I think people need a crystal ball. The major driver, the major dynamic is China, Beijing, who has basically declared, they have a new theory. They and the Russians have worked out a new theory of world order, which our elite, I haven't seen anybody, I've talked to people, our elite just is clueless. It's called civilization state. And the new world order is based on civilization states. People who have a heritage of 1,000 years or more, i.e. the Russians, the Chinese, not the Americans, probably not the Europeans. And the Chinese civilization state has a mandate, this is Xi Jinping, and it goes back a long time. They have a mandate to rule the world, and in particular Asia. They have claimed the South China Sea as domestic waters. There is no historical evidence for that. In fact, there's a document floating around from 1837 I've seen that the King of Vietnam went out to some of these islands and planted his flag, you know, Western European nation state style. Okay, so in order to take over the South China Sea, you got to dominate ASEAN, the political organization of the Southeast Asian nation. Now, how do you do that? You buy two governments, Cambodia and Laos, who will always vote with Beijing. Laos, I don't know too much about. They're Lao communists. They're just sort of, you know, low-grade thugs. Actually, Cambodia is run by low-grade thugs, Hun Sen and his family. Hun Sen's been the dictator since the end of the UN thing. His son is taking over now. His son, to be nice, we gave his son an education at West Point. The guy's a 4-star general in the Cambodian army. It's a mafia don kind of setup, which I'm sure you see, which the Cambodians, I'm going to talk about, but they figure out ways of living and surviving. But all the money is being sucked up to the top. And all the other aid is Chinese aid, but which is strategically designed to keep an authoritarian government in power. The last thing the Chinese and Hun Sen want is an educated population. Because educated people tend to think for themselves. And goodness knows, they might come up with ideas. They might organize politically. I really feel, I see a dark future for Cambodia. And we Americans have turned our back on them, I think. We send ambassadors over there who suck up to Hun Sen. What you people are doing is marvelous. I wish you well. You should expand that, because the Cambodian people really need it. Thailand will make its way forward in a Thai way. Okay? They negotiate. The Chinese family, Thaksin, which has been sort of trying to dominate politics for 25 years, I think Thaksin is finally out. They don't have an alternative yet, but he's gone. Hun Sen is also Chinese. One of the things I discovered a number of years ago, there used to be a page in Wikipedia, which has disappeared. It was called Sino-Khmer. I found it by accident one day, you know, Sino-Khmer. And they were listing all the famous Chinese families in Cambodia. Every one of the leading Khmer Rouge were Chinese ethnically. Which then leads to another thought. I don't think anybody, I think most of all the Cambodians, they can't understand this. And another factor you may have seen here, and it's also, I'm told, in Cambodia, for the first time in history, Theravada Buddhist Cambodians are becoming Christian. They never were interested in Christianity. But if you live through that, Theravada Buddhism, its explanation is that somehow it's your fault. Because everything that happens to each one of us is karma. And if you have bad things happen, that's bad karma. Where did that come from? But if you're Khmer and you start thinking, my mother, my grandmother, my this, let's go back, there's no bad karma. It doesn't work. So what do you have in Christianity? You have a loving figure of Jesus Christ who cares about you. One of the things, just very quickly, by accident, I'll just note it because this is another thing where I tried my best, but the UN administration for Cambodia, which ended the killing fields, bringing in a third party, a neutral party, that was my idea. But my idea was that the UN would come in and the administrator of Cambodia would be Lee Kuan Yew, who just stepped down as the leader of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew, and all this is also, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, with the Rosenmeier, it's all about governance. Lee Kuan Yew built up Singapore through good governance, right? No corruption. Things got done. High education. Cambodia, if it gets good governance, they could, but Hun Sen will never give them good governance, right? Anyway, the Secretary General, he picked a Japanese, Mr. Akashi, to be the administrator. And Akashi's a very decent man, but he's very Japanese. And the Japanese practice in many ways is to listen to everybody. It's called nemawashi. Everybody gets to say and this and that. So the story I heard, which may be apocryphal, is that when the UN administration is being set up and they're going to create a cabinet and there's who's going to be prime minister, who's going to run the ministries, they've got representatives of the different political factions, Hun Sen, Sihanouk's, sitting around. And Akashi says, what are the suggestions? And Hun Sen says, good idea, I'm on board. We will support the United Nations. I will take the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior. And Akashi said, thank you very much. And Cambodia just has been downhill ever since. But if Lee Kuan Yew had been there.
Okay, any last questions? I know Steve's going to stay around for a little bit to answer any questions that you might have that you don't want to ask out loud.
Or if anybody wants to ask me about moral capitalism or something, Professor Wenzel said I should entertain all those questions.
Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. Thank him for coming tonight.